1.3 webinar this morning. We're going to give everyone another 2 minutes to log on because we have a lot of people signed up. So just wait with us a few minutes and we'll get started. And welcome to the OASIS DITA 1.3 New Features webinar. I'm Joanne Hackus, and I'm the chair of the OASIS DITA Adoption Technical Committee, one of the sponsors for today's webinar. And I wanted to make sure everyone knows, I'm sure there'll be lots of questions if I don't say this. Yes, we are recording this presentation. And I hope that you'll actually rely on it in the future to catch up on what is coming with DITA 1.3. In today's program, we have asked the members of the technical committee who have been instrumental in developing DITA 1.3 to present a list of what we feel are some of the key new features that you can expect. We'll begin with Chris Eberlein, who will give us a bit of introduction and background into the 1.3 initiative. Stan Daugherty will be talking about context-sensitive help. Robert Anderson will introduce the concepts of branch filtering, followed by Chris Nitchie, who will talk about the improvements to the key functionality that I'm sure many of you already know about and are using, and introducing key scopes. We have a number of new learning and training pieces that Mark Myers is going to talk about, and a brand new initiative called Release Management that Tom Chihak will tell us about. Nancy Harrison is going to take us through some of the new domains that have been added to 1.3, and Bob Thomas will explain the troubleshooting new topic type. At the end, we will be taking questions, so be prepared to ask your questions. Put your questions into the box called Questions on your screen. We'll be using that to watch your questions and to make sure that we're answering them sometimes if we have to as we go along, but generally at the end in the Q&A session. So now I'd like to turn this over to Chris Eberlein. And Chris, I think you've got control.
Thanks, Joanne, and welcome. I'm glad everybody called in. I'm Chris Eberlein and chair of the OASIS DITA Technical Committee. And I'm just going to give a very quick overview of the DITA Technical Committee and our various releases. Next slide, please, Joanne. So who is the DITA Technical Committee? We're 16 people who meet weekly on a telephone call for 60 minutes. And you can see pictures of us here. Some of us have never, ever met each other in person. Generally, we use Robert's Rules of Order, but practically we operate by consensus. And either we're sponsored by our corporate employers or we pay as consultants and individual members for the work we do on the TC. And for many of us, it's really quite a labor of love and something we've been doing for quite a long time. Next slide, please. So just to give some background, this is, previous slide please. This will be DITA's 4th release. DITA was released in June 2005 after it was donated by IBM, and it had all the basic components of DITA: topics, maps, the specializations of topic, the rudiments of the architecture, specialization, conref, map-based organization and linking, and a certain number of domains. Our next release, DITA 1.1, added to that with support for bookmap and Devel, as well as some new domains and new elements. Next slide. 1.2 came out a little close to 4 years ago in December 2010, and here we did add substantially more information types and really modified the architecture. We added key-based addressing and a number of other features, including constraints. Next slide, please. So what's coming with DITA 1.3? I know that's really what you're interested with. And I'm going to let all of the panelists address this issue, and then we'll summarize at the end of the webinar after the questions. But I did want to address some of what I think of as the invisible but very important changes. We've put a lot of attention to improving the quality of the specification, making it more usable and better written. And we are now able to single source our XML grammar files. We've added support for RelaxNG as the new normative version of the DITA grammar files. And we're able to single source DDDs and XSD files from the RelaxNG. Another important thing is we've just made a lot of improvements in our technical committee processes and reducing our technical debt, because we want to be able to continue forward with future releases of DITA after 1.3 quickly and expeditiously. So our next speaker is Stan Doherty, who will be talking about the context-sensitive help specialization.
Hi there, Stan Doherty. Thanks, Chris. Greetings from Boston and the DITA Help Subcommittee under the able leadership of Tony Self of HyperRate. A little background. With DITA 1.3, we've addressed two of the most common pain points that help practitioners using DITA have reported to us, mainly the inability to manage context-sensitive help callback IDs from within DITA sources themselves, and the inability to manage kind of target runtime display information from within DITA sources. So we've developed these two DITA 1.3 enhancements in direct response to the feedback from you, the help community. So your feedback and your participation does matter very much to us. Next slide. All right, so the big problem we have with context-sensitive help is we're asked to generate an increasing number of user assistance targets from the same DITA sources. If each target requires a callback or a set of display metadata in some proprietary resource file format, we get into a lot of trouble because we have to maintain multiple copies of this same metadata apart from our DITA sources, and it's simply not scalable. So our proposed solution is to extend the metadata vocabulary that is in DITA to support both the generation of callback IDs and target-specific display characteristics. And once we have this information, as you can see inside DITA, then we can apply the same filtering and assembly logic to it as we do for any of the other content that we author for help. So first, what we've got is to assist help practitioners when managing callback IDs, we've done is we've added 3 metadata attributes to the existing element named resource ID. The first 2 of those are app ID, which identifies a reference topic and to an external application and supplement the existing attribute named app name. The second one, UX context string, actually specifies a callback context ID for that topic. Okay. Next slide, Joanne. Thank you. In this map example, what we have is one map topic ref, as you see, with 2 resource IDs underneath it. Each of those resource ID elements defines a separate and addressable callback ID for that help topic. So you can have multiple IDs for a single topic, and this allows downstream help processors, which are basically apps, to select the appropriate ID based on attributes such as app name or app ID. So if you've got iPhone in one branch and Droid in another, you can discriminate between them within the same topic call. Next slide, Joanne. Thank you. You can also add this updated resource ID metadata to the prologue of an individual topic if you want that information to go wherever the topic goes on its own. If a processor encounters callback metadata for a topic that is defined both in the map and in a topic prologue, it can read the value of that third new attribute called UX source priority and determine precedence. And in this example, you see we have UX source priority in the map set to map takes priority. So that means the callback value ID pound 4500 that we see defined in the map gets precedence over the value ID pound 4501 defined in the topic. So it kind of puts conflict resolution logic into this thing. So recall, and what's important about this is that you're able to route different parts of a map out to different outputs, like HTML viewports and things. Okay, to define one or more target display profiles in a map, we've added a map element called UX window, and we've added an attribute to resource ID called UX window ref. Okay. So what you do is you define one or more target display profiles in a map and add display target attributes to that new map element in UX window. And so for in this example, you see a target display it should be the window or whatever should be 400 pixels high and 500 wide and so forth. And all this information, which had been previously managed in external resource files, is now manageable and visible in DITA. Next slide. Thank you. Once you've defined a target profile, you can then use this new attribute, UX window ref, to reference the name of that profile, and you can reference it from any topic ref for a help topic anywhere in your map. And in this particular example, for example, we have a target display profile that's named Mobile 1, that's in red there, and it is now associated with a help topic that's named dialog-1.dita. So any downstream help processor can generate a resource file that contains the information from this Mobile 1 profile about how it should be displayed, and any other definitions or profiles that you might have for the screen as well. All right, next slide. Thank you. So to kind of wrap up where we are is we see three benefits for DITA help practitioners from what we're doing in 1.3. I'm not going to read all the bullets here, but at a high level, we've added semantics, so you have a more rich environment to capture your metadata. We've added logic that allows you to do branching, in terms of do conflict resolution, so that's all goodness. And for a lot of people, we've reduced the overall dependencies we might have on external dedicated help authoring tools. I mean, a lot of this stuff now lives in DITA, and that's all goodness. So I want to thank you for listening. Please get in touch with me or anyone else on the help subcommittee for any follow-up conversations. And I'm going to pass the baton over to Robert Anderson from the beautiful tropical paradise of Texas to introduce branch filtering. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. So yes, I'm here to speak about branch filtering. And so first off, what is that? What problem are we trying to solve? Well, the problem is a relatively common one. It's intended to address the situation where you have a subset of your publication, subset of your map, that uses unique conditions that don't apply for the rest of the book. This may come up when you have different sections of your map that are intended for different audiences. Maybe you're reusing content from somebody else who has their own names for conditions. Maybe you have one section of your map that's intended to be published for different audiences. So DITA does define the Devel syntax that was added in DITA 1.1 to control include and exclude conditions. However, until now, there's been no formal mechanism to associate those conditions with just a portion of your publication. So how are we addressing this issue? We're doing it with the new Devel ref element. You can see here in the code sample that you place this element in a branch of a map. This would be the portion of your map that you want to have build with those conditions. So in this case, you reference the conditions in the Devel file, conditions.devel. The include and exclude rules that you set in that file apply to this branch and this branch only. They don't apply after, they don't apply before. They do apply to everything referenced from this division, so all of the content in parent.dita, in the first child, the second child, and the third child. They also apply to this branch itself. So if your conditions include a rule to filter out audience equals ABC, which you can see on the second child here, that second child topic will be entirely removed from this branch. So when would you use this? Well, you would use it as shown in the previous slide. Again, this is the simple case. So the conditions apply to that section. Global filters will still take priority. So whatever is filtered out at a higher level stays out. So as an example, to kind of explain that higher filter wins, imagine that you're publishing something, and at a global level, you want to say, filter out everything except Linux. So nothing about Mac, nothing about Windows. Now, imagine down inside of a branch, you want to filter by Linux variant. If you accidentally said inside that profile, include my Macintosh content, include my Windows content, it wouldn't make sense because you know at a higher level you're publishing this only for Linux. By the same token, if you have already said this branch is going to be narrowed down to a specific variant of Linux, within that branch you can't turn on other variants. So whatever's filtered out at a higher level stays out. A couple of potential uses you can see here on the slide. You may be reusing the external content that has conditions that you don't use elsewhere, or you may want to publish something where a section is only relevant to one audience. So as I say, that's the simple case. But what else can it do? The branch filtering mechanism also allows you to publish a single branch of content multiple times within a single publication, applying different conditions each time. So imagine you have a product manual with an install chapter that needs to be repeated for different audiences by operating system, marketing guide with different regions, and maybe the most common scenario, you have a homeowner's how-to book with landscaping chapter that's filtered by climate, or maybe everything that applies to the house is the same for everybody, but the section on landscaping needs to be published once for people who can do anything, and again for people whose neighbors get upset at seeing the coffee filters out in their tree branches. So to give the actual example here, as I wait for the slide to paint, it seems I'm unable to advance. There we go. For the advanced case, this is where you have common content that is for unique audiences. So this is when most of a product manual applies to all audiences, but a subset of the content applies to unique audiences. Now imagine you have a product manual where the how-to information, the learning information, and the troubleshooting applies to everybody, but you have an install chapter that ideally would be filtered for different audiences, either by operating system, by hardware, perhaps by region, where you need to filter once so that people have imperial units, and again for metric. With DITA 1.2, your only options were to publish one guide for every operating system, every audience essentially, or perhaps you could publish many versions and then stitch them together into one publication, or you could break apart your manual so that you publish your manual, but then you publish multiple install manuals, so separate documents. With DITA 1.3, you use the code that you see here, 2 Devel ref elements. So how does that work? So when the publishing process encounters the first Devel ref, it operates just as in the simple case earlier. So you would publish this entire branch filtered by imperial units. The second Devel ref means publish this again using these conditions, so with metric units. So in this case, the install branch is published with imperial units and then metric. All other branches are published as usual. So imagine if everything we've had in this presentation up to this point was considered common, but now the slides could branch apart, and the next slide could be repeated for everybody on this call, with each version of the slide tailored to your individual publications. So to summarize, with DITA 1.2, you had 3 different manuals with your different conditions. DITA 1.3, you can bring them all together with filters that apply on a single branch. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chris Nitchie for Keyscopes.
Thank you, Robert. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about some enhancements to the key mechanisms in DITA 1.3. Keys were introduced in DITA 1.2 as a way to address content via a name or a key, as opposed to via a URI or an href or a location. And this winds up having a whole bunch of benefits, but one of the most important of them is that it allows you to reuse a topic without necessarily needing to reuse everything that that topic links to, because you're linking to it by a name. And those names could be mapped to different link targets in different publications and different route maps. But if you had more than one definition for a given key, they would be overridden. They would be overruled. One major limitation of the key mechanism in DITA 1.2 is that a given key could only have a single definition for the entire map, the entire publication. So here on the left, we have a version of a hypothetical publication where we have key 1, key 2, and key 3. Each one is defined multiple times, perhaps because different parts of the publication really want to use different resources for those keys. But that's impossible in DITA 1.2. Basically, the first definition of a key is the one that takes precedence. So in DITA 1.3, what we wanted to enable was the ability to have a key have different definitions at different areas of the map. So here on the right, we see kind of a logical picture of the way keys can work in DITA 1.3. You can declare these things called key scopes. And a key scope is a region of a map that has its own key definitions. And key references outside that region can reference those keys, but not directly. So here we have key 1 defined for the entire publication. That winds up being a definitive definition for that key for the entire publication. Just as before, you can use higher level maps and higher level scopes to define publications for that entire region, define keys for that entire region, and they take precedence over any child scopes. But within a child scope, you can define additional keys that are only visible directly from within that scope. So here we have key 2 and key 3 defined in both scope 1 and scope 2. And because they're wrapped within a scope, those definitions only apply for the references within those scopes. And using this mechanism, we can have different definitions at different areas of the publication. Advance to the next slide. So the way we accomplish this is very straightforward. We've introduced a new attribute called key scope. And you can put the key scope attribute on any element, any topic ref element or any map element in your entire map structure. And what that does is put a virtual fence around that area of your publication that prevents the key definitions from getting out. So any map or topic ref can declare a key scope. And if you want to reference a key that's kind of fenced off in one of these scopes, but you're outside the scope, and I'll talk about specific use cases around this in a minute, what you can do is specify the scope name in your key reference. So you can say keyref equals scope name dot key name, and that will allow you to specify a specific definition for that key, to reference a specific definition for that key in a specific scope. But within a scope, you don't need that qualifier. You just reference keyref equals key name, and in one scope that might lead you to one resource, and in another scope that would lead you to a different resource. So here's an example of how this would work. Here I've got a map that serves as an omnibus publication for service information about 2 different models of tractor. And it turns out we've got tractor X and tractor Y, and the oil change procedure for both tractors is exactly the same. And I want to reuse the topic and the task covering that procedure for both regions. So here you'll see I've got references to common oil change procedure.dita in both of these topic heads. But the actual kind of oil that you use in these 2 different tractors is slightly different. And so I've got specific topics describing the oil specifications for those tractors. Because I'm reusing the oil change procedure, if I wasn't using keys and if I didn't have key scopes, then the first definition for that oil chart key would take precedence. And in DITA 1.2, both references to the oil change procedure will wind up linking to the tractor X oil chart because it's the first definition in my map. However, in DITA 1.3, since I've wrapped each of these in a key scope, then the definition for each reference to that oil change procedure is different. So when I render oil change procedure into the tractor X scope, the link to the oil chart will link to the tractor X oil chart. When I render that same topic under the tractor Y scope, the key ref that points to oil chart will render to the tractor Y oil chart topic. Some key benefits to the way we've implemented scopes in DITA 1.3 is that it's fully backwards compatible with DITA 1.2. This is true of all features that we're implementing in DITA 1.3, but I wanted to call it out for key scopes because I could see it being a source of confusion. All of your existing maps that you've authored in 1.2 using DITA keys will function exactly the same way as they always have because you don't have any key scope attributes in them. This only comes into play if you start introducing the key scope attribute into your map structure. The key reference semantics are entirely unchanged. Even if you want to reference a key that's in a different scope, you do that via the key name or the scope name followed by a period. And that period is a valid character in a key name. So the key ref semantics, your topic authors that are using your keys, still only need a list of valid key names. Some of those might contain periods, some of them might not. But it's still, for the author, a simple list of potential link targets with names. The topic authors don't need to know all of the scoping systems for all of the maps that a given topic's being used in. And the markup, as I said, for declaring key scopes is very, very straightforward. And this new feature enables some use cases that were utterly unavailable in DITA 1.2 because of the way key precedence worked. So one thing you could do is create an omnibus publication. So you have a whole bunch of standalone publications that have overlapping key names. Before, you couldn't combine those into a single publication because the first definition of a key name is going to be the effective one, and suddenly the linking in the subsequent publications is going to be broken. But now you can wrap each individual publication in its own scope, and each of those publications, even though it's part of one big publication, will continue to resolve to its own local definition of those keys. Similar to that case, you can have multi-product documentation where the key names might overlap, like introduction or how to use, or oil chart is another example from earlier. You can wrap each product in its own key scope, and the keys will function correctly for each region. And the last use case I want to bring up is this idea of a multilingual publication using con-key-res. Generally, when you send a topic off for translation, the translators will translate the topic, but they won't translate the con-key-res attributes in that topic. And so before, you would take your translated topic and you would have to have a different book for each language so that the key res resolves correctly. But now in DITA 1.3, you can embed multiple translation in the same publication and wrap them in a key scope specific to that language, and the con-key res will resolve appropriately. And that's all I have to say about key scopes. I recognize that it can look a little bit complex and scary, but hopefully this has helped elucidate some of the details and aided in understanding. I'm going to pass control over now to Mark Myers, who's going to talk about the learning and training updates.
Thank you, Chris. Hi, everybody. This is Mark Myers. I work at SAP. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about updates that were made to DITA 1.3 for learning and training scenarios. Learning and training support was added to DITA 1.2 back in 2010. It was done under the leadership of John Hunt. He was the subcommittee chair there. And I have to say that they really did a very excellent job. It was a very thorough, very comprehensive specialization that they came up with. At SAP, we create a lot of educational materials. And we have actually been using DITA 1.2 to create all those education materials for almost the last 4 years. So we've actually been using DITA 1.2 learning and training internally, and we've produced, I think to date, we have over 2,000 products that you can buy or get for free as a customer out there. So if you come to any SAP class and you take a instructor-led training course or a virtual live classroom or an e-learning course, the materials that you'll see there were actually produced with DITA 1.2, which I think is very nice to see how well it's been used. We think that once we implemented DITA 1.2 for our learning and training content production, we found that about the 1.2 implementation had about 95% of our modeling requirements already covered. So it was really very comprehensive, but there were a couple of things that we found we had to change in order to meet all of the requirements that SAP had for our educational materials. One of those we think is a feature that's going to be very common that a lot of other users will want to do, and that is the scenario that I've outlined here. So we wanted to standardize the markup and the method for referencing and storing learning objects in learning groups as separate objects in a file system or a repository. If you're in the learning and training world, you will be very familiar with the concept of learning objects. You know, it was defined many years ago in the Cisco Reusable Learning Object white paper, and has been talked about for many years. The DITA 1.2 did a very good implementation of learning objects and some other features as well. We wanted to really use those features to create all of our content, to create very modular learning objects that can be reused then in various, many different learning maps, or courses as we would call them. So what I've outlined here is a scenario in which we might make a standard learning map. Okay, that's my first one on the left in gray. And let's say that that is a course that's going to be for instructor-led training, traditional classroom-based training. And it might have a duration of like 3 days. Can you go back, please? Sorry, somebody's advancing my slides there. Can you go back to the slide with the 3 different learning maps, please? Okay. So you can see on that first slide here, or on this slide, we have a learning map. Like I said, it's about instructor-led training, covers about 3 days worth of content. It has multiple learning groups. So these might be like a unit or modules of a course, and it has multiple learning objects within them. Okay. Then we might, a very common scenario is to say we want to create a variant of that course. So maybe we want to take the main course and create a subset of it and say, okay, well, this is maybe for a virtual live classroom via a WebEx or something. We want to reuse a lot of the content, but we want to take some of it out. So for instance, here we've made a new learning group. We've removed one of the learning objects, and we've removed learning group 4. But the rest of the content in gray here is just reused from the first learning map. Then maybe we want to make another variant, let's say for e-learning, and maybe this is only 1 day. So we want to reuse the same learning group that we created here, but we want to remove some other things, some other learning groups. We remove learning group 3 and learning group 4. Okay. The learning objects in the groups really are intended to be reused in multiple maps. However, we found that in DITA 1.2, there really wasn't a consistent approach in the way it allowed us to reference learning objects in learning groups. DITA 1.3 addresses this by adding some new elements. So we add 2 new map references, learning object map ref, learning group map ref, and 2 new wrapper elements, learning object map and learning group map. And I'll show you an example. Okay, so here we have an example from DITA 1.2. Okay, so if you're using DITA 1.2 out of the box, the contents of the learning objects are defined and redefined within a learning map. Okay, this allows you to reuse the contents of the learning object, like overviews, contents, summaries, and so on, but not the learning object container itself. So as an example, over here on the top right, you see this is our main learning map. Okay, it has 2 learning objects in it. And here you can see the learning object. The first one is called DITA 1.2, learning object A. And then it has some references to an overview, a learning content, and a learning summary file. Okay. Where we found that there was a cause for maybe some errors or inconsistency is that if we wanted to use that same learning object, in many different maps, we had to basically redefine it in each of those variants. So for instance, at the bottom right here is a variant learning map. Okay, so this is, we're taking the standard course and we maybe want to create a variant of it for another delivery method or another duration. Even if we want to use that same learning object, we have to basically redefine it again. We have to put in a new learning object element, put the title in again, and put the references in again. And as you can see, this is inefficient and it's perhaps error prone because then if there's some changes, if one of these links changes or the title changes, you have to go back to each learning map where it's referenced and make the change there. So what we did in DITA 1.3 is with those new elements, we now have, so for instance, you can now wrap your learning object with an element called learning object map and reference it with a learning object called, or with an element called learning object map ref. So here you can see this is our main learning map that we created with DITA 1.3. Here you can see now instead of actually defining the learning object here within this map, I just have a reference. So now I use this element called learning object map ref. It has an href attribute, and you can see now it's just pointing to this learning object map. Okay, and the learning object map is just a wrapper basically around the learning object. So it's just taking the standard learning objects like we have from 1.2, putting a wrapper on them, and now you'd be able to store this learning object map as a separate component in your repository and point to them. So now we can have many variants of our main course, and they can all point to those, that same learning object map. So the same learning object map is just reused again and again and again. I didn't illustrate it here, but the same approach is now available for learning object group maps. So you can now have a learning group map where you store your learning groups as separate components in your repository and then point to them as well. So that would allow you to have like units of content that you can basically reuse. So just to summarize, that gives you a standardized method for referencing learning objects in groups. And I think it really helps to encourage reuse of learning objects in groups, both within an organization and even across companies. So the dream of DITA is that not only would a company be using it across all the organizations within the company, but if there's implementers out there and they're implementing hardware and software solutions with components from different companies, and they had access to the DITA content to create training materials, they'd be able to take learning objects from company A, learning objects from company B, and blend them into one kind of seamless, harmonious set of learning content. The next feature that I want to talk about is that we have improved the interactions that are available in the learning and training model. So interactions, by interaction I mean assessment questions. So these could be multiple choice, true, false, single select, sequencing, those types of questions that you might use in a self-assessment, post-assessment, pre-assessment. Okay? In DITA 1.2, those the actual markup for those assessment items was somewhat limited. So you had like a question statement, an answer statement, and feedback, and within those you could really only put text. So that was fine for a lot of textual-based content. But some of our implementers, like Amber Swope, Elliot Kimber, and others, have noticed that, hey, they want to make more robust questions. So, for instance, have a question that has a list in it, and then a set of answers that somebody has to select. Or have a question that has an image or a table, for instance, in it, and then the people have to make a selection. So here's a couple examples. Here, there's a question, there's a list of different points, and then there's the answers where somebody has to indicate, okay, which from the points above are correct. There's another example on the right where they have a table as part of the question, and then the participant has to take an answer, based on that table. These examples were really not easily possible in DITA 1.2 because you were not allowed to put a table or a list within a question. So we wanted to improve the learning and training interactions. So we went to we wanted to be able to put more robust markup within the question statements, within the answer values, and within the feedback, so that we can have more, a wider array of content available in there. The way we did that was by defining two new domains for the learning and training and specialization. One is called interaction-based 2 domain, and another one was called the learning 2 domain. These new domains provide a base model that allows multiple block questions now. So you can have multiple block elements like multiple paragraphs, multiple images, multiple tables within your questions, your answers, and your feedback. So now you can have much more robust assessment items. So otherwise, they're pretty much semantically identical to the original domains. They just allow multiple blocks within those elements. The original domains are still available. So if you have assessment items in DITA 1.2, you'll still be able to use them going forward. You don't have to change them. But you might want to consider, if this is something that looks interesting to you, if you would like to be able to have more robust assessment items, you might want to switch and start using the Learning 2 domains because they will allow this more robust authoring, this more robust modeling. Okay, so here's just an example. Right. So as an example of a more robust interaction, this is a single select 2 question. This is one that you would see with the DITA 1.3 enhancements. Here you can see there's a paragraph. The spinner below is divided into 8 equal sections. Here is an image now in the question. So the participant can now see the image. That was not possible in 1.2, but will be available in 1.3. And then there can be additional paragraphs. What is the probability that the pointer will land on yellow? So if somebody, now when we render that, we will be able to see the assessment item, see all of the blocks that are within the paragraph, and then the participant can make their selection. So just to summarize, 2 features that we've added for DITA 1.3. There is the enhancements to allow learning object maps and learning group maps, and improved assessment modeling. So now I'm going to turn it over to Tom Chihawk, who's going to talk about release management.
Tom, we can't hear you.
I seem to have been. Am I coming through now?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Hi, my name is Tom Chihawk. I work for Freescale Semiconductor, and I'm a member of the DITA Technical Communications Subcommittee. We have a couple of, at least two proposals for DITA 1.3 that will be talked about today that came from this subcommittee. This one, release management, or sometimes as it's known, revision history, it has other names, is a pretty elementary one. It's unglamorous and tends to get overlooked, but for some people it's very important. A couple of use cases caused us to work on this particular feature. The one that I'm familiar with is that we have large manuals that we revise periodically, and we have both internal customers, meaning designers and validation people, but we also have external customers, and both of them would be extremely unhappy if we produced a new 2,000-page manual 6 months after the last one without giving them some help finding the important changes. We have tried various automatic methods of presenting changes, but these were inadequate. Machines don't do a very good job of discriminating between changes that are simple and changes that are really important. So we really have to do this ourselves. And in another use case, another organization was required by a regulatory agency to record the date and time of all changes down to the second. And there's nothing in DITA right now to support this, so in both of these cases, what happened was we resorted to external files. In our case, we're using topics. I believe that the other party was using a database or a spreadsheet to track the changes that were being made. And the solution that we have is the release management domain. This is an optional domain that allows content workers to record release notes for the changes that they make, and so they can discriminate between improvements or changes that are not mandatory for the customer to read and changes that are required. This domain was based on the existing bookmap book change history domain, but simplified fairly considerably. It allows us to log the changes directly in the topic, which will be a big help for people that need to do this, because you no longer have to procure any external document and spend the time doing the thing twice. You can record your change directly in the topic where you made the change. This domain calls for elements only, and no processing has been requested or specified. You'll need to use an X query or a script to gather up the changes, and you can use these scripts or X queries to generate an external report or perhaps a an appendix or a topic that will be included in your publication. It allows you to filter by date and using select attributes. So if you have a case where you need to report a change only in one time only and not repeat it every time the document is revised, that can be done. If you want to do it cumulatively, you have that ability as well. Here are some of the elements in the domain. I won't go through these in detail. It's really pretty basic. You're just talking about who, what, when, and why in some cases. And you can create an ID that you want to associate with the change for further tracking. There are also elements that allow you to refer to an external tracking system, and so it's easy to trace changes that way. There are 2 date fields, started and completed, and then a description of the change that can be used in a report. Here's an example of a simple change showing that the change item, which is the individual release note, supports select attributes, so you can filter that way. And in this case, we have some changes that apply to 2 products or only 1 product. It shows the date that the change was made. The date can be either a date string or a timestamp, such as is used by Unix systems, and then the summary of the change. There should be several benefits for this. The first, for the people that actually work with the documents, it will be much easier to make these changes if they can be made directly in the topic. So you'll no longer have to make the change, write notes about it, and then enter it into another document. You won't have to get the other document to make the change. And that should result in better reporting and increased compliance. The readers will benefit because they'll get better reports on what's actually been changed. Nothing will be forgotten or lost. If you want to do an info center display, it'll be very easy to have a tab for the actual topic and a tab for the history. So that should be quite simple. And of course, if you're using a content management system, in some cases you can't actually update check-in comments after they've been made. So it allows the release notes to be edited, improved, made more accurate after the fact. And it also will allow you to record the metadata directly in the topic without having to rely on any content management system or change management system. Next slide, please. Before I turn the floor over to Nancy Harrison, I'd just like to say that we are working on a white paper on this subject, and I hope in the white paper also to have a sample X query to show how these change notes can be gathered up. And now Nancy Harrison will talk about the DITA domains for version 1.3.
Nancy, would you please unmute your phone? We cannot hear you. Nancy, would you please unmute your phone yourself? Thank you. There you go.
Okay. Sorry, I had it muted in 2 different ways. Phones are complicated. Okay, I'm going to give a fairly brief summary of new domains in DITA 1.3. you've already heard from Tom and from Robert Anderson about domains associated with other major features. I'm going to talk about domains that are features in and of themselves, and in a number of cases, they're domains that really connect DITA to other domains outside of the DITA world. So we have two kinds of new domains. One are domains that extend DITA semantics. And as I say, Tom and Robert have described the ones that are associated with branch filtering and with release management. The other new semantic domain that we've created for 1.3 is called XML Mentions. An XML Mention is a domain that allows DITA users to talk about markup. Now, a lot of people really don't want to talk about markup, but on the other hand, there's a subset of users who need to talk about markup, and we discovered the need for this particular domain in writing the DITA specification. And we're pretty sure that there are other groups writing specs and writing about various markup languages that will find this particularly useful. We've made it pretty simple. There aren't a whole lot of elements in it. We put the basic major elements in. We put in element, XML element, XML attribute, text entities, parameter entities, just the really major parts of markup so that it's easier to write about markup. As a backup, we created a markup domain, actually, that lets you extend the XML mention domain if you want to do really, really, really complicated things. But the XML mention domain is probably going to be enough for most people to write about XML. So that's the major other semantic extension that we have made. We also did a couple of domains that, as I said, extend DITA and make it easier to use non-DITA languages. One of them is math, and the other one is graphics. So for MathML, a lot of our users need math. I mean, we have people writing in the scientific area, in academics, and they need to be able to use equations. And up to now, in order to use equations, you have to do fairly convoluted things and incorporate MathML externally. We have made it possible now to use MathML from within DITA, which makes it much easier to include your equations right in your document. We have also set up the equation domain to allow users to number documents arbitrarily. We discovered that in academic and scientific writing, this is a real requirement. And so the equation domain lets you specify any number you please. If you look at the example below, that equation 3.26 is actually specified because nothing is generating it. Someone's actually given the equation that number. So we think that the MathML and equation domains will allow for scientific and academic writers to use DITA in a way that's much more natural to them. And then the other domain that a lot of our users need to access is the SVG graphics domain. And again, we have now allowed users to incorporate SVG within their DITA documents instead of having to declare that SVG domain and incorporate references some other way. there are now direct ways of incorporating SVG content in a DITA document. So though we think that those three domains will make it easier for people to address particular needs that our users have made clear that they have using DITA. And now I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to turn it over to Bob Thomas, who's going to talk about troubleshooting.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm Bob Thomas. I worked on the Technical Communications Subcommittee implementing troubleshooting features for DITA 1.3. So anyway, this involves a new topic type and also new troubleshooting elements. So let's get right in there and take a look at a sample troubleshooting topic. This is pretty much typical for what you'd find in technical communications. Troubleshooting is something we identified as an information type we wanted to implement in 1.3. So as you see here, the title for the topic generally describes what the symptom is. There's a condition that talks more about what that is, and then there's a cause followed by a remedy. So what I'm going to show you now is a screen capture of what the markup looks like. As you can see here, we have the condition and then this thing called a trouble solution. What that is it's a wrapper element that contains a cause followed by a remedy. We did this so that you can have more than one trouble solution for troubleshooting scenarios that are a little more complicated than this simple example. Next, we're going to move on to what I call elements that are embedded inside of topics. There are a couple of them that were introduced to the task topic, the first of which is a step troubleshooting element. In this output example here, we have a step result saying that system administration panel appears, and then we have step troubleshooting information that talks about what happens if it doesn't appear. This follows the same general pattern as appears in the topic. We've got a condition followed by a cause followed by a remedy. So for us, the markup looks like this, and no surprises here. It's pretty much what you would expect it to look like. Following that, we have a similar element on the task level. This comes after the steps and after the result for the steps. So here we have task results saying that the new content uploaded to the website now appears on the website, and this task troubleshooting element talks about what to do if that's not the case. Notice here that there's actually a reference out to some other procedure. So here's the markup for this, and as you can see, there's a cross-reference pointing to some other procedure for doing this. And the final one of these markup that we've introduced for troubleshooting is a trouble note type. Excuse me. This is a note type like caution or note or tip or something like that. So there's now a type called trouble, and this gives a way to give on-the-spot corrective action sort of information if what the reader's seeing something they don't expect to see or not seeing something they should see. So that's kind of a quick run-through of the new markup that's part of the troubleshooting for 1.3. So anyway, why did we add troubleshooting? Well, the one reason is that we found a number of companies were independently specializing troubleshooting information, and this suggests that it might be a basic type. So the Technical Communications Subcommittee collected a number of use cases, and these models are the end result of that. So anyway, there's some advantages to this. Now we have a way for writing organizations to have a consistent set of troubleshooting information. Because it's now part of the semantics, it improves the author's ability to be consistent. I think the other thing I'd like to point out about the troubleshooting is that in terms of the actual troubleshooting topic type, one of the things that happened that I think is very important is that you can now reuse steps from tasks directly in troubleshooting. So I think that this is a really good feature. It also relies on another 1.3 feature that allows you to borrow elements from other information types. So that's pretty much it as far as the troubleshooting goes. If you want to know more about this, I've written a feature article for OASIS about this, or you can contact me directly. So at this point, thanks for your attention. I want to turn this back over to Joanne and Chris.
Thanks, Bob. We have a number of questions from our participants. And Joanne, I'd like to pass the first one over here to Stan Doherty. And the question is, why wasn't the reference to the UX window made as an element within Resource ID, so you can filter based on output format?
Yeah, you can either filter obviously at the topic ref level, or you can get down and put wrappers around the resource ID. That's the internal kind of Devel-based filtering. I think you also have within your options for how you want to handle the processing of this. With all these processors that are going to take this metadata, they're going to be fairly custom jobs. They probably are going to go into this resource ID structure and interrogate things like the map name, app name, and app ID, and do their own branching based on that. So I think you have a combination of the default filtering that you get from DITA, from DITAvel, and any of the elements that support that filtering, you wrapper them or ID them as you go with attributes. So you have that level, but I think also people are, companies that are going to do very targeted generation of resources and generation of help topics and things. They're going to have their own custom transforms, their own XSLTs, and those can have branching and filtering as well. So it's at 2 levels.
Thanks, Dan. And I'll answer our next question, which is, are the scripts to generate DDDs and XSTs from RelaxNG made publicly available? And the answer is yes, that the OASIS Dita Technical Committee will make these transformations available as a zip download. It will be in a stable location on the OASIS site and easily available. So our next question is, and I'm going to direct this to Tom Chihak, and we have a question, can the release management domain be used for Arata? Tom Chihak? Well, I think we'll have to come back to that one. Tom may have lost his sound. And so my next question is for Robert Anderson. And our audience participant writes, branch filtering. Is there a way to embed the Devel elements in the map? Or does the Devel ref always have to point to an external file? I'd rather not have to maintain several unique Devel files.
There is not. It is something that was discussed and eventually decided against it for a few reasons, one of them being that it's a whole set of elements that would have had to move from the sort of external, not specializable, not core data into an actual set of data markup, and this was really viewed as a simpler way to do it. That this way, with the reference, you can also define your set of conditions once and reuse them multiple places in the map, which is a actually fairly common scenario where, like in the examples I gave, I referred to only doing it in the install section. You may want to use those same sets of conditions to duplicate or to filter your troubleshooting section later in the same document. But it was considered.
Okay, our next question is for Chris Nitschke. It's based on key scopes. And our audience participant asks, Is there any info on the ramifications of scoping for DITA OT processing? Key ref resolution slows down DITA OT processing. My hope is key scopes will improve this, but it may turn out to be the opposite.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Could be a little louder, Chris.
Okay. Yeah, this is a little bit outside my area of expertise. I believe when we were designing the feature, we did consult with those who do develop the open toolkit to make sure that what we were proposing sounded reasonable. In terms of the performance implications, I'm really not qualified to say for sure. My suspicion would be that because it does add some complexity onto the processing, it might slow things down a little bit. But at the same time, I know the Open Toolkit is actively developing version 2.0 and making lots of advancements in various performance levels in various areas. I might pass the buck to Robert on this one a little bit, who might have more to say.
Sure. I'll just add that it's hard to say for sure because the feature is still under development in the toolkit. But yeah, it's going to depend on several things. And I know that the key ref processing in general is a lot faster in the coming 2.0 than it was in previous versions. In general, I would say for toolkit-related questions, we should probably keep those to the toolkit list, and we would be thrilled to have you asking and answering there. So, yeah.
With that said, we do have a number of other DITA OT questions here, and I think we can go ahead and ask them and answer them briefly. I do want people to remember that the DITA Open Toolkit is not developed by the DITA OASIS Technical Committee. It is a very separate open source project, but yet we do have people on the call with some knowledge of the DITA OT. So our DITA OT questions here, and Robert, perhaps you can answer these very briefly, are what is the level of support for DITA 1.3 in the latest version of the Open Toolkit? And is the support of new features, especially branches and keyscopes, expected in the DITA OT soon?
Yeah, so those of you who are familiar with the toolkit know that Jarno Ilavirta has done an incredible amount of work on it lately, and he spent a lot of the last few months reading the spec. He's been one of the most prolific commenters on the 1.3 spec, and he's been trying to develop some of those features. If you get the latest test builds for DITA Open Toolkit 2.0, a lot of the features are there. Not all of them are complete. Not all of them are there. Key scoping is not there yet, and branch filtering are not there. Those are the two big ones that are left. But in general, Jarno has been working to support as many of the features as possible for 2.0. Hopefully they will be in there. The current stable release, DITA OT 1.8, does not support the DITA 1.3 features.
Thanks, Robert. And I'll take the next question, which several people have asked, and that's when will DITA 1.3 be officially released? And my answer to that is we have been trying to track towards December of 2014, but my suspicion is that it's going to move towards the end of first quarter 2015. It is difficult to pull a new release together with everybody working on a volunteer basis. So bear with us, folks. We're going to get DITA 1.3 out as soon as we can and at a point where we have good confidence that we have reviewed the new specification and the XML grammar files and ensured that everything is at a point we are really comfortable with. Our next question is, and I'm going to point this one to Nancy Harrison. I don't see an example of the markup used for XML mention. What elements are being added to support this?
Well, actually, that's a good question.
And I can jump in here, Nancy, and say
the elements are, as I said, XML element, XML at for XML attribute. There's a parameter entity element. There is a text entity element. I'm trying to
namespace.
Namespace, right? there's only about 8 elements in the entire domain. So it's not a large domain. The original proposal actually suggested a whole lot more, and we felt that it was too complicated for people to just use. And that was why we had created we created a markup domain for extension. We actually created the XML Mention domain as a specialization of markup so that people can extend it. I will take that as an action item to post on DITA users, the list of items for XML Mentions, unless there's a better place to post it.
Thanks, Nancy. And here's another question that I'm going to ask Chris Nitchie to answer. And our participant asks, I understand XREFs between separately generated PDFs were going to be addressed in 1.3. Is that still in the plan?
It is in terms of the markup that you would use to author such things. The processing of such things is left up to the implementation. The way that works in authoring is an extension of the new key scope mechanism, whereby what you would do is reference from a map representing a publication to another map that you want to link to via a map ref whose scope is set to peer and with a key scope attribute. And then from within the source map, you can author links to the keys defined in that other map using those scope qualified key names. So it might be other publication.sumTarget in your key ref attribute. So the authoring mechanism for those things is laid out in DITA 1.3. As you can imagine, the processing of those things can be complex and is generally contingent on the tool being used to generate the publications. Different amounts of knowledge are available to different tools, and ultimately, in order to resolve those things to output, you need to know not only the map that you're trying to link over to, but what the published version of that map looks like and what the keys that are defined in that map are addressed as in the published output. So there's quite a bit of additional work that needs to be done in the tools in order to support the links that are authored the way DITA 1.3 tells you to. But DITA 1.3 does lay out a standard authoring mechanism for those links.
Thank you, Chris. And I'm going to take the next question, which is, how do I help move DITA 1.3 forward? It sounds good, and I want it soon. And my answer there is there's several ways that people, particularly architects, practitioners, can help us move forward. And you can take out our DDDs, our current XML grammar files for a test spin, and give us feedback. You can author with the new content that is not reliant on specialized processing and give us feedback. Once our official OASIS review begins, then we also ask everybody to take part in commenting on the specification. We log all your comments and we address them. And finally, a very important thing is if you're interested in using DITA 1.3, you need to talk to the vendors of your editing tools, your authoring tools, your CCMSs, and ask what their plans for supporting the new DITA 1.3 features are and what the time frame is.
As we've noted, Chris, this is Joanne again, we know that in some cases vendors are waiting to implement DITA 1.2 features because they're waiting for customers to ask for those features to be implemented. So even though you might think that you don't have much control over what happens in the tools you're using, you really do. And it's important for you to know as users, as implementing these things in your organizations, that look at the spec, look at what we're presenting here. If you're not into reading the spec, look at the presentations and the articles coming out in the next 6 months from the adoption committee, and talk to people about that feature. Do you really want it to? Do you really need it? Is it something that's going to be helpful to your organization? And you can get help from the committee members and others to help understand how you might apply a feature. And then you can go back to your vendor and say, please implement this. It's part of the standard. We really want it implemented. because they're waiting for you to tell them, for you to take the initiative.
Thanks for adding that on, Joanne. And I've got another question here that I'm going to pass over to Chris Nitchie, and that is, can release management be used for Arata?
Yes, I think so, though I don't think I'm necessarily the right one to answer. But yes, because you've got for each release that's tracked in that markup, you can put comments. Each change that you track that way has a description element. I don't recall off the top of my head what you can put in that description element, but I suspect that you could extract from that information the errata that you would need.
And Tom Chihak, if you have rejoined the call, is there anything you'd like to add there?
Hi, am I coming through now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, as a matter of fact, I said that this functionality was known by different names, and when I started working at Freescale, we actually called these things reference manual errata, but it confused everybody because people would say errata, and then the next question was reference manual errata or silicon errata. So we gradually kind of moved away from that name a little bit, but that's kind of what they are. If by errata you mean the things that used to be issued on little slips of paper in books that said, on page 7, change X to Y. So yes, it is errata of a sort.
Thank you, Tom. And I've got a question here. I'm not sure whether this should go to Robert Anderson or Chris Nitchie, so both feel free to jump in here. And the question is the peer scope getting an updated definition in 1.3?
Yes, jumping in before Chris, but Chris may have a better answer. Only slightly. It still means the same thing, but peer is scope equals peer is part of that definition of what Chris was talking about earlier, the cross-deliverable linking. The scope equals peer on a reference to another map is a way to indicate that your key reference is going to something that, for example, might end up inside of another PDF. Apart from that, I don't think the definition of scope equals peer is changing in any way or being added to.
Right. I don't believe the language around the name peer for the scope attribute has changed much, if at all. The difference in DITA 1.3 is that in DITA 1.2, there was nothing in the spec mandating different processing for scope equals peer versus scope equals external. They had meaning that was specific to the content. It had semantic meaning, but it didn't necessarily have mandated implications for processing. And that is changing in DITA 1.3 in that we are using it for this cross-publication linking mechanism. Yeah.
Thanks, Robert and Chris. And the next question is for Mark Myers. And it is, are there any efforts to make DITA content according to the learning and training specialization consumable by e-learning systems? For example, Moodle.
That's a very good question. For DITA 1.2, you have the basic style sheet output that comes with this part of the DITA Open Toolkit, but the style sheet development itself is not part of the scope of what this committee is doing. We're mainly focusing on the model, not all the style sheet outputs. So there would have to be an independent effort on part of the DITA Open Toolkit to publish to e-learning. With that said, at the current time, you'd be left up to developing something like that yourself. We produce at SAP, we do produce a lot of e-learning, and what we had to do was develop our own sort of content player, which is kind of like a bucket, that has the SCORM integration, has all of the communication that needs to take place between the content and the learning management system. The content player has the features like the navigation and the menu and media playback and so on. So we developed this content player that's sort of an independent application, and then through a small API, we can use the DITA Open Toolkit style sheets and just publish HTML output and then put that into our content player and run it. And that allows us to use the same content player for multiple sets of DITA content. But we had to build that ourselves. Unfortunately, that is not offered commercially.
I could also point out, this is Joanne, that for the person asking the question, we're very successfully putting data learning and training content into Moodle. As Mark says, you have to do some of your own development to do that, but it's working great. So all those things are possible. If part of the question is, can we interface to the e-learning systems? The answer to that is absolutely yes. Data output SCORM content, and it's all compatible, consistent, compliant SCORM output.
Thanks, Joanne. And I'm going to direct the next question to Robert Anderson, although I'll probably make a few comments on it myself, and that is DITA 1.3 backward compatible? And speaking as the TC chair, we make every effort that we can to ensure that all of our 1.x releases are backwards compatible. Robert, anything to add there?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, it's backwards compatible. That means that any DITA 1.2 compliant documents that you have will validate against 1.3. We're not going to have anything in 1.3 that you have to change in order to move up. This also ties into the scope equals peer question from a couple of moments ago. That question was about scope equals peer changing. You'll note that in Chris's description, he said that the definition of scope equals peer is not changing. That's also true for all of these other features. If we have a feature that means one thing, it still means the same thing in DITA 1.3. There may be additional new functions that are defined around it, but if you have 1.2 content, it should still mean the same thing in 1.3. So yes, it is backwards compatible.
Thanks, Robert. We have another release management question, and so I'd like to direct this to Tom Chiak, and it reads, for release management, how are deleted topics dealt with if the metadata regarding the changes lives in the topic? What about topic content that gets moved around? Is this logged as an deletion and an addition?
Well, the domain can be included in maps, so probably the simplest way to deal with it is to log that type of change in the map. So that's probably the short answer.
I think,
Thanks.
Tom, couldn't you also, you can suppress the publication of a topic. So instead of, at least for the release management collection of data, you can not include it in the output and still have a comment coming from that topic into your release log.
That's true too, yes.
And I'll address the next question, which is, what is the status of lightweight data? Is it 1.4, 1.3.1? And we have just formed a lightweight data subcommittee, so I'd encourage all of you that are interested in lightweight data and OASIS members to join that subcommittee so you can follow its work. But our primary focus right now is getting 1.3 out the door. When we get 1.3 out the door, our next focus will be lightweight data. And whether we're not going to call it 1.4, we're potentially considering it a add-on feature. I can say pretty clearly we are not expecting to release a 1.4. After 1.3, our plan is to focus entirely on lightweight data and DITA 2.0. Would anybody on the TC like to add anything to that? Okay, well we have run through the questions, so I am going to move on to our last slide, which really is just a summary of what we will be shipping with 1.3. We have the new information types, troubleshooting and learning and training. We have changes to the architecture, and the two big items there are key scopes, which will enable cross-deliverable referencing, branch filtering, as well as some expanded syntax for filtering that we did not go into in this presentation, support for RelaxNG and reuse of structural specialized specifications. Again, that drives our ability to single source our XML grammar files, and the reuse of structural specifications is what's letting us reuse the steps element from the task information type within troubleshooting. We have our new domains, DitaValRef, Markup, XML Mention, SVG, Equation, MathML, Release Management, and the updated Learning domain, and a handful of new elements and attributes. As we've mentioned, the troubleshooting elements and user assistance elements. Two things that we did not talk about in this presentation. It really was a challenge to figure out what aspects of the 1.3 release we could cover cohesively in this time period. We do have some small additions to the highlighting domain. I believe there is a overline and a line through. And we have a new element called div, which is intended as a wrapper element, basis for specialization and for grouping content. And that really takes us to the end of our presentation today. This is our last slide.
Chris, can I mention something about the articles and the subsequent plans?
Please do, Joanne, and then I'll wrap up.
As you know, the Adoption TC publishes feature articles. We have a whole set of plans for feature articles. The first one out is Bob Thomas's article about troubleshooting. You can go to dita.xml.org or to the OASIS homepage of the DITA Adoption TC to find those articles. We'll also be putting the PDFs of these slides and the recording of the webinar on the Adoption and the TC home pages, public pages, on the OASIS site, and also you'll find them on ditaxml.org. So thank you all for taking part, and we hope to see you at the next set of webinars. Adoption TC will be holding webinars on some of these specific topics to give you some more depth. Thank you.